the irradiation process in the reactor, one of the elements that appears as a result of this irradiation process, of the fission process, is plutonium-239, which is also a fissile material, as you learned from Zig, used in nuclear weapons. And it happens so that fuel in reactors, to sustain the fission reaction, has to have is a certain amount of a certain level of processes going on in it. And unfortunately, as the process itself goes on, after just a short period of time, the fuel rods are not able to sustain the reaction to the level that is desirable. And so after a certain period of time, the fuel has to be removed. And about 96% of the spent fuel rods is uranium, which has less than 1% of fissile uranium-235. Often it can be 0.4 to 0.8, and up to 1% of this spent fuel is plutonium. And then in some cases, it gets recycled as fresh fuel through the reprocessing. And this is basically a process where you separate the leftover uranium from the plutonium, and uranium can be reintroduced into the fuel cycle, and plutonium, as it happens, can be used for nuclear weapons. And this is why you see this corner here, another way of obtaining nuclear weapons, nuclear material. And the reprocessing, hence, is the second part of the nuclear fuel cycle, which is sensitive to proliferation, and which draws a lot of attention from people who closely observe the non-proliferation on the global arena. And only a few countries in the world, because this is such a sensitive technology, only few countries in the world actually have reprocessing facilities, which would be France, Russia, UK, and India. And there is an upcoming plant in Japan, Rokasho, which was supposed to be started up in 2022, but its startup was again delayed. And with that, just, I don't know, keep this scheme in mind, and just it will be easier for you to understand what the NPT is about and why it is not only about weapons programs, but also about nuclear fuel cycle and what nuclear safeguards are. Thank you so much. And with this, I now give the floor to Benoit.
Thanks, Valeriia, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to just, oh yes, I can share my screen. Excellent. So I want to first apologize for not being with you in Albuquerque, but I'm going to, just in a few minutes, give you a sense about what we know and can know about public attitudes regarding nuclear weapons policies. Very briefly, I want to emphasize the fact that the Nuclearnologist program that was mentioned and that I founded in Paris is distinct by two features. One is its refusal to accept funding that would carry any conflict of interest. So we're refusing funding from any entity that has a nuclear weapons policy preference or agenda. were only funded by entities that provide funding on the basis of scholarly evaluation. And we're essentially an interdisciplinary team that crafts interdisciplinary projects on the basis of the question. So what I'm going to tell you today is a result of the work I did with someone who's a survey designer, because those are skills that I do not have. So it's going to be simply 3 observations about public attitudes regarding nuclear weapons policies. Let's go right in. I want to start by saying that you may have been exposed to claims that we know what people would do if nuclear weapons were used. A lot of discussions of that was had in the media, and I want to start with a cautionary note about the limits of validity of that knowledge and the need to be very cautious in terms of what we claim to know and become able to know about people's support for future possible cases of nuclear use. The second claim I'm going to make is about the US public and the public of allied countries regarding the resumption of nuclear testing, and that's going to be the outcome of a survey that was conducted in 2019 and that we're actually replicating in the coming months. So I do not have future results yet. We can talk about them when they come out. And the third observation will be on a common claim, in particular in my country, in France, but also in the UK, that the French public is supportive of existing nuclear weapons policy in the country. And surveys conducted in 2018 and 2019 shows that this claim is actually misguided. Let's go straight to it. My first claim essentially comes out, if you want to hear more about it, from a paper that I co-authored with my colleague George-Wilhelm that came out in Security Studies. And so what we say simply is that when we're exposed to claims that, a particular set or a majority of the US public would support use of nuclear weapons in particular scenarios, we need to remember that there are incompatible results in existing scholarship. Some results suggest that, and other results suggest the opposite. So we're still kind of facing contradictory type of findings. But in the tendency to accept those findings as valid, there is a sense that the data obtained from emotionally invested respondents is more reflective of what they really think. The starting assumption of the most recent studies is that, detached surveys is not reflective of people's real views, because when push comes to shove, they're going to be emotionally invested. That's actually a debatable claim, because if you look, for instance, at the death penalty, in one study of the US public opinion, as many as 95% of respondents opted for capital punishment in at least one of the vignettes that was meant to charge them emotionally. And no one would seriously claim that 95% of US respondents actually are in favor of the death penalty. We would look back and we would take seriously their responses when they're not emotionally charged. Similarly, support for capital punishment immediately drops when respondents are encouraged to approach the question with more distance and are made aware of costs and miscarriages of justice. And finally, just in terms of the design of the legal system, crimes of passion are often viewed with more leniency than premeditated ones, precisely because crimes perpetrated in affect are presumed to reflect moments of mental or emotional disturbance rather than who the defendant really is. So let's keep those in mind when we're presented as we now know that a large scale of the US public would be in favor of nuclear weapons use, or would be supportive of it. This is all the more true as the methodological debate about surveys and what surveys are good for is also asking us to be cautious, in particular about people's or respondents' claims about not their present or past attitude, but their future attitude towards events that they've never experienced and they may not have thought about before. Those are additional reasons to doubt that actually surveys are adequate instruments to get to know how people would react to an event such as nuclear weapons use. Second observation that I wanted to share with you today that comes out of an article that was published in the National Interest in 2020 is simply the outcome of a series of surveys conducted by my team with colleagues Stephen Herzog and Jonathan Baron about the US and allies, about their support for the resumption of nuclear testing. And to put it bluntly, you can see that there is a vast majority of respondents who are simply disapproving of that support. In no country is there less than 70% opposing the resumption of nuclear testing. Again, we're replicating that study now. If you find those findings too old, we will have more for you in a few months. If you're more interested in the US domestically, what's interesting is that there is no party or no political affiliation that would give you a majority of respondents in favor of the resumption of nuclear testing. This was at the moment when this discussion was being had. The third claim that I wanted to engage with is simply this claim that publics in some nuclear weapon states, such as my own country, France, or the United Kingdom, are in favor of existing nuclear weapons policies. There are, again, methodological problems with existing surveys and claims of that nature. The first one is that the question actually is rarely asked. In France, if you look, the entity that asked the question is the communication department of the Defense Ministry. And the problem is when they ask the question itself incorporates all the assumptions of official policy. So, it assumes that nuclear weapons do deter everything we want them to deter, and only deter. It also sometimes assumes that non-nuclear weapons would not deter at all. And it doesn't offer alternatives, and it doesn't include the issue of costs or opportunity costs. So as a result, the numbers we get are more of a measurement of the effects of a communication campaign than measurement of the actual support for a policy. Problem is, several French experts uncritically repeat those findings as showing objectively consensus. So what I did in my book was that I essentially thought about, okay, one way to counter those biases would be to simply ask respondents how they feel towards the requirements of nuclear deterrence. How do they feel about what the nuclear deterrence policy is asking of them? And so at first, we simply asked the same question, which is, do you actively support government decision in that respect? And the findings in France and the UK show very low level of support. If you think of support more broadly as non-opposition, you still not find a majority. And if you start asking about requirements of the policy, such as agreement to have your taxes used to fund the arsenal, or agreement with the need to be targeted as part of a deterrence logic when you're faced with an adversary's a large nuclear arsenal that would essentially target your nuclear forces as a way of doing damage limitation, the level of support is really, really low. And here I'm not pretending to discover that French and British publics are secretly anti-nuclear, but what we're discovering is that there's no active support, and that the one attitude that gets a majority is actually a sense of disempowerment. 49% of respondents in the UK in 2018 and 2019, and 57% of respondents in France said they didn't feel legitimate to participate in the nuclear weapons discussion. And that means that what we often present as a policy that produced consensus and public support actually produced disempowerment and distancing. Those are the three findings I wanted to share with you. And, I'm open to any questions, comments, and I hope that was interesting and useful. I just want to emphasize for those of you who actually were hoping that was the last slide, there's one more thing, which is that you could say, yes, that's not relevant because anyway, citizens would be happy delegating those decisions to experts. And you could say they actually may appreciate not to have to worry about those issues. It turns out of the 2018 survey that we conducted, that's not true for a majority of respondents, except in the Netherlands. That's what you see in panel A at the top of this graph. We're close to a majority in Belgium. In what citizens express instead is desire to be consulted and desire to be given options. Interestingly, when we replicated that survey in 2019, the survey confirmed those findings with a plus or minus 2%. So that's something that kind of helps us flesh out how we should reformulate the common claims of consensus as production of powerlessness in the face of desires to be consulted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Benoit. You're perfectly on time. I would suggest that we hear from the other two speakers, and then it can be an interesting discussion because we actually have, three different aspects covered, which are kind of addressing similar issues. So with this, I give the floor to Tariq.
So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968, and it's still one of the most important multilateral nuclear arms control treaties.
Right. Could you possibly put it in the presenters mode because we see?
I am trying to do that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So while it was doing it, I thought that I would sort of start speaking while the computer is trying to do its bit here.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just didn't know if you knew it was in this mode or not.
Yeah, no, I know, but I thought instead of, having a gaping silence.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes complete sense. I'm not going to interrupt you anymore. Please go ahead.
Okay. I don't know what's happening here, but so I wanted to start by saying that right at the beginning of the nuclear age, at the time of the Manhattan Project, it was recognized that nuclear energy had two facets. One facet, of course, in the context of the Manhattan Project was that for making a weapon, but the second facet was using atomic energy for peaceful purposes. Now, there have been 9 countries that have exploded nuclear weapons and are currently possessors of nuclear weapons. It is suspected that South Africa and Israel may have carried out a clandestine nuclear test in 1979 in the South Atlantic. The one point that I want to make in this slide, which I hope you can see, is that every nuclear weapon development program has benefited and or provided assistance to another nuclear weapon development program. So while the literature will tell us that the Manhattan Project, which made the first nuclear weapons at Los Alamos, was purely a United States enterprise, but all of the technical work or most of the scientific work in terms of fission and so on was done by European scientists. Much of this work was done in Europe, and much of the other work was, of course, done in the US by these scientists who fled Nazi Germany and the war to the US to complete the manufacture of the first nuclear weapon devices at Los Alamos, and of course the detonation of the very first device in July 1945 at Alamogordo, which is a place where I gather some of you visited. Valeriia, which slide are you seeing now?
Still the opening slide.
The black one.
Yep.
Are you seeing the green one now?
Yes, we do. You might want to just kind of make the left panel smaller and just go on like this, because I think it's not cooperating and does not want to
Good
do
point.
the presenter thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Good. And not everyone agrees with me, but I claim that there is only one true weapon of mass destruction, and that is nuclear. And that is because we do not have any effective defenses against nuclear weapons. And also, nuclear weapons are the only weapons that have the potential to destroy all forms of life on Earth. And while both biological weapons and chemical weapons can cause a lot of casualties, we can defend against them. We've just recovered from the COVID epidemic. Before that, we had the SARS epidemic, and these were biological agents that were spread and killed a few million people, but nonetheless, we know how to deal with them. So this doesn't mean that chemical and biological weapons are not horrible weapons, but nuclear weapons are the true weapon of mass destruction in terms of ending all forms of life, and also the catastrophic humanitarian consequences caused both by historic nuclear weapons testing, and we've had more than 2,060 nuclear weapon test explosions since 1945 to 2017. Many of these were above ground, and most of them after 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Partial Test Ban Treaty, nuclear weapons testing was driven underground. Pretty much everyone living in the Northern Hemisphere carries small traces of cesium in our bones from the effects of these atmospheric nuclear tests. This cesium will not kill us, but it's still there in small quantities, and it is transmitted generation to generation. So this was the slide I was talking about, that every country that has made nuclear weapons has received and or given assistance to every other country. So the USSR used the design copied from the US, even though Kurchatov, who was the Soviet nuclear weapons designer, the counterpart to Robert Oppenheimer, had his own design, but they were not sure whether it would work, and they wanted to keep their heads on their shoulders because Stalin likely would have chopped them off had their first device not worked. The United Kingdom benefited from cooperation with Canada and the United States. The French also benefited from cooperation from the UK and the United States. China benefited from the Soviet Union. Israel benefited from the United States, a number of other European countries, including France. South Africa had assistance from Germany. Indian scientists trained in the US and got some assistance from the Soviet Union. Pakistani scientists also trained in the US and got assistance from China. And North Korea, it got assistance from the Soviet Union. So all of these countries are equally culpable. No nuclear weapon program can be regarded as sort of legitimate or illegitimate. It's in the eyes of the beholder. Countries will do what they need to do for their national self-defense. And I hope you can see the next slide, which is on nuclear weapons development and dedicated programs.
Yep. See.
So every country that has developed nuclear weapons has had a dedicated nuclear weapons program. There has not been an instance of a country using a civilian nuclear energy or a nuclear reactor program for generating electricity to make nuclear weapons. As Valeriia explained to you in her opening presentation, reactor-grade uranium for reactors ranges from 3.7% to 4.95% enrichment level, whereas heavy water reactors like the CANDU reactor of Canada uses natural uranium. And this really cannot be used for nuclear weapons purposes. So all these countries have had dedicated programs to either enrich uranium to weapons grade or to separate plutonium from irradiated nuclear material from plutonium production reactors, so to speak, to make nuclear weapons. And there are only two nuclear materials that are the key for making nuclear weapons. Absent highly enriched uranium and plutonium, one cannot make a nuclear weapon. You can have a bomb, but it's not a nuclear bomb. So we've had many treaties to address the issue of nuclear weapons proliferation. The very first resolution passed by the General Assembly in 1946 called for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. I don't have time to go through the various proposals, such as the Baruch Plan from the US, the Gromyko Plan from the Soviet Union, but I will fast forward to the 8th of December, 1953, when then President Dwight Eisenhower made this famous speech in the General Assembly called the Atoms for Peace speech, where the United States proposed to share the peaceful applications of nuclear technology under safeguards to be administered by an international atomic energy agency in return for countries taking on a legal obligation not to use this technology for nuclear weapons purposes. The Atoms for Peace program went from 1953 to 1962. And all of the important Western countries that we can think of, India, Pakistan, well, they're not Western, but Germany, Italy, Sweden, and others, they all benefited from training in the US from nuclear materials and research reactors. The US transferred highly enriched weapon-grade uranium for research reactors to many of these countries. Much of this highly enriched uranium was then repatriated back to the US. The Soviet Union also did the same. The difference between the Soviet nuclear cooperation was that they provided the fuel for nuclear power reactors, but they also took back the fuel for nuclear power reactors, which is why we haven't had a proliferation case, so to speak, in the former East Bloc other than North Korea. So Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, they didn't use that technology to make nuclear weapons. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty came about after a famous speech by President Kennedy in 1963, where he warned that unless we had some international controls on the spread of nuclear weapons technology, by the end of the decade of the 60s, we could have 15 to 20 countries with nuclear weapons. So the Soviet Union and the United States then began to cooperate, starting from 1965 and 66, to draft a Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was finally opened for signature in 1968 in Geneva. So the original form of the Non-Proliferation Treaty only had articles calling for non-nuclear weapon states not to develop nuclear weapons. So at that time, the objects of proliferation concern were countries like Sweden, Italy, Germany, Argentina, Brazil, and others. And these countries did not want to give up nuclear technology, which was an emerging technology in the late 60s and 70s. There was talk of using peaceful nuclear energy, that electricity would be too cheap to meter coming from nuclear power reactors. There was talk of nuclear-powered ships, nuclear-powered airplanes, and so on. So these countries did not want to give up their right to peaceful uses, and therefore they insisted that in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the inalienable right to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes should be recognized, and this is mentioned in Article 4 of the NPT. So countries say that's sort of a God-given right, it cannot be taken away. And then we also have in the Non-Proliferation Treaty provisions for verification of nuclear technology transferred to non-nuclear weapon states carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Non-Proliferation Treaty assigns this responsibility to the IAEA in Vienna, and the IAEA then came up with the system of verification. Although the Non-Proliferation Treaty provides the legal mandate that all nuclear material and all nuclear activities in a non-nuclear weapon state have to be declared to the IAEA for verification to ensure that nuclear material has not been diverted from peaceful to military uses. So non-nuclear weapon states such as Canada, Mexico have comprehensive safeguards agreements where everything is under safeguards. Nuclear weapon states, of which the Non-Proliferation Treaty recognizes 5, United States, Soviet Union, then Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China, they have voluntary offer safeguards agreements where the IAEA can do safeguards on some aspects of their peaceful nuclear activities to rectify this imbalance between verification of everything in non-nuclear weapon states. So for example, in the United States, 2 metric tons of plutonium coming from the weapon cycle is always under IAEA monitoring and verification. An enrichment plant in China bought from Russia is also under safeguards, as is the plutonium separation plant in France that separates plutonium produced in Japan for separation of plutonium. And then non-NPT states like Israel, India, and Pakistan have a item-specific safeguards agreement, whereas the items of nuclear reactors and material that were acquired by them from supplier states carry the requirement for having IAEA safeguards. So these are not comprehensive safeguards. Now, for IAEA safeguards purposes, 25 kilograms of uranium enriched to 90% or higher is regarded as one significant quantity equivalent to material for one nuclear weapon. So because uranium is a very heavy and dense metal, by weight or by volume, it could fit into this sugar bag that you could buy at your local Safeway or whichever Whole Foods or wherever you go. And then for plutonium, it's 8 kilograms or less. And by volume, it's the size of a grapefruit. Now, in the two small pictures, you see a puck of metallic plutonium being held by a person with just rubber gloves. So this form of highly enriched uranium will not kill a person because it is not emitting damaging radiation. Whereas in the second picture with the yellow gloves, you see that the puck of metallic plutonium is in a plastic bag. And that is because we do not want to inhale plutonium particles, which will embed in our thyroid. And within 24 to 48 hours, we will die a painful death. And then in the bottom black and white picture, you see a plutonium pit from a dismantled nuclear warhead. So you will remember that President Obama called for a nuclear security summit to put dangerous nuclear materials under international monitoring and verification. The very first one was held in 2010 in Washington, the second in 2012 in Seoul, the third in 2014 in The Hague, and the fourth in 2016 again in the United States. So only 17% of the world's nuclear material are under IAEA safeguards. It's the part shown in brown. 83% of the world's uranium and plutonium is in the military fuel cycles of the 9 countries with nuclear weapons, more than 90% of this quantity in the hands of Russia and the United States. So they are in different forms, in intact nuclear weapons, in storages, and so on. So if we were to show it to you in a pictorial form, there are roughly 1,400 metric tons of highly enriched uranium. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. So it means we have 1,400,000 plus kilograms of highly enriched uranium and 499 metric tons or 499,000 kilograms of plutonium, completely outside of international monitoring and verification. And recall, 25 kilograms or less of HEU and 8 kilograms or less of plutonium for one nuclear warhead. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty now is the only remaining treaty between Moscow and Washington. Of course, other parties, there are 191 parties in all, but if we look at the two nuclear superpowers that are currently in a very conflictual relationship, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was jettisoned by both countries in 2019. The Russian Federation stopped the implementation of the New START agreement in February this year, and the US also has suspended parts of its implementation. But the 5 nuclear weapon states like the Non-Proliferation Treaty because it is keeping 186 non-nuclear weapon states from developing nuclear weapons. Now, unfortunately, in NPT review conferences, which meet every 5 years, for the first time since starting from 2015, the Russians and the Americans have been at each other's loggerheads, whereas in the past they were not so. So this is showing another break in the infrastructure or architecture of nuclear arms control that we inherited from the Cold War, and this is slowly beginning to crumble. So in order to prepare for a review conference, there is a preparatory committee meeting in 3 years preceding the review conference. So the last review conference was held in New York in 2022, postponed from 2020, marking the 50th anniversary of the NPT. Unfortunately, because of differences over matters concerning Ukraine and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant safety, the countries gathered could not agree on a final outcome document. And they also did not agree on a final outcome document in 2015 over the matter of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. So the preparatory committee for the 11th review conference to be held in 2026 will be held in Vienna in August of this year. So to conclude, yesterday, one media outlet asked me to write an introduction on the role of the media in promoting nuclear disarmament. So I wrote them that introduction, but I also asked ChatGPT to compose a poem on the role of the media. And I just took 3 of the stanzas from that poem, which I think may resonate with you, gathered in Albuquerque. And you can read it on the screen. O media, wielder of truth's embrace, unveil the path to a nuclear-free space where atoms won't dance in destructive spree, but in harmony forge a world truly free. With pen in hand and cameras ablaze, capture the horrors of atomic haze, reveal the scars etched on earth and sky, igniting hearts with a resolute cry, highlight the voices of those who yearn for a world where peace forever burn, where nations unite in a fervent plea to dismantle weapons that bring agony. So with that, I'll end my presentation and we'll be happy to answer your questions later. Thank you.
Especially for this wonderful poem. It's something that I have never heard before, and I don't know, I'm just always amazed with what current technology and human creativity can
And we hope to never
do.
hear it again, Tariq.
I didn't hear you, but you can tell me later.
So now we are going to hear about the TPNW process, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, from George-Wilhelm Gallhofer. The floor is yours, please.
Hi, and thanks for having me. So from my side, you've heard about the humanitarian consequences already over the last days, and you've heard about the dire state of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. So now what I want to talk to you about is how a group of states seized on this new knowledge, how we reframed the debate on nuclear weapons, actually giving life to the wider regime, and also about why it matters. Now, at the outset, we need to talk a bit more about where we are. I mean, you already discussed this to an extent, but we are now really at the moment, the closest moment, really the world's been to a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. You'll hear more about this when you have the Doomsday Clock presentation, I'm sure. But now with the Russian nuclear threats and the nuclear blackmail that's going on, we've really reached a global decision point. Do the nuclear armed states double down on nuclear weapons, risking others following their lead? Or do we critically question basing international security on the constant threat of mutual annihilation and constant existential risk? Well, my point was that we're at a bit of an inflection point where we're now facing, of course, as you know, the Russian nuclear blackmail and nuclear threats. And the question really is now, do we double down on nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, risking, of course, further proliferation, other countries following the lead? You heard already, for example, from Tariq that there was quite a danger of there being maybe a dozen or more new nuclear armed states already before the NPT. And we find ourselves at a similar waypoint. The other alternative being, do we critically question basing international security on these constant threats of mutual annihilation and constant existential risks? This kind of critical questioning really has been missing in the public and also in the academic community for a while, not least because the discourse itself has been so dominated by the 5 nuclear armed states and the NPT and their allies. Benoit being one of the big exceptions, I may add, who we've heard from today. But so what did we as states and civil society do on this question? Well, about 10 years ago, we started to bring together data about the impact should nuclear deterrence fail. You heard some of the findings over the last days on the humanitarian consequences and the risks. But to me, maybe the most consequential new evidence on the humanitarian consequences relates to the fact that even a so-called limited nuclear war, using only a fraction of today's arsenals, could lead to a nuclear winter with huge amounts of soot being transported by firestorms that result from nuclear explosions into the higher layers of the atmosphere. And that will then disperse around the globe, lasting several years with significant temperature drops in most moderate climate areas. That in turn would mean that staple food production would be severely impacted globally. And the conferences also equally showed that it was impossible to appropriately address the immediate humanitarian emergency and the long-term consequences from these detonations. Now, these facts, of course, raise profound legal and ethical questions and issues about the legitimacy of the nuclear status quo, because a nuclear conflict simply knows no borders, and the consequences globally are far more severe and profound than we had previously understood. And putting together this new data really turned out to be a rallying point. It showed crystal clear that nuclear disarmament must concern all states. And it led to both the democratization of the discourse and to a paradigm shift. A democratization because until about 10 years ago, knowledge about the consequences and the risks was mostly confined to nuclear armed states and partly the academic community. Testimony by survivors was largely ignored. They were just simply confined to side events or conferences or maybe small speaking slots in NPT review conferences, if even that. But now suddenly with this new knowledge, even the smallest of states felt empowered to participate in negotiations and demanded their views to be taken seriously. And survivors' testimonies were now not only included more front and center, but they were actually also vindicated by the attention to the scientific facts. And looking at these new and extremely disturbing facts also set in motion a process leading to the TPNW, and with it a paradigm shift. Now, the overwhelming majority of countries in the world does not rely on nuclear weapons for the security, as you know. But at the same time, as you saw, these catastrophic humanitarian consequences and unacceptable risks are borne not just by the nuclear weapon possessors, states and their allies, but by everybody, by the entire international community. And the TPNW is the expression of this as a clear rejection of international security being based on nuclear deterrence, being based on the belief that war can be prevented by threatening total annihilation. And that all the risks of misunderstanding, accidents, and rationality can be entirely eliminated, thereby creating this kind of nuclear stability. Now, of course, nuclear deterrence is so ingrained in the discourse that everybody asks, so why does the TPNW matter? It won't disarm Russia or North Korea tomorrow. The nuclear weapon states aren't even in it, so it's toothless. But that really misses the central point of the treaty. The TPNW is not really about projecting might for coercion. It's about stigmatization and a change of the discourse. And it's about showing that nuclear disarmament, as required under the NPT, is actually possible by presenting concrete pathways to, in fact, in the TPNW towards it. Let's take that apart a bit. A country like Austria, of course, will not be able to force nuclear armed states to rescind their arms or eliminate them. But what we can do as small and middle states is to band together with others and to generate pressure for change. And we do this by demanding compliance with international law, with disarmament obligations that the 5 nuclear armed states in the NPT, for example, have taken, and also by stigmatizing as in changing also the mindsets. Think of chemical weapons. What self-respecting country would say in its national security doctrine today, if we feel threatened, if we are attacked, we will indiscriminately use chemical weapons? But it's not that long ago that chemical weapons were considered as a legitimate weapon of war. And it took a prohibition to take them off the table and decades of disarmament to follow to actually eliminate the stocks that were in existence. Think also of anti-personnel landmines. When we started the process leading to their prohibition, we were told this is impossible. They are needed for national security, for securing our borders. Even very moderate countries, considered landmines to be an essential staple for national security. But today, there are only 35 countries left that are outside the treaty, and even fewer producers, actually, as they have a really hard time getting funding for a weapon that's internationally prohibited. And these processes are not really far in the past. 1925 for chemical weapons, 1997 for anti-personnel landmines. But these treaties didn't just prohibit the weapon, they really shifted the discourse. They made these weapons unacceptable, and they led to impressive global disarmament processes, something that we haven't been seeing on nuclear disarmament. You just heard from Tariq on the NPT with its disarmament obligations and commitments that countries took in the framework of its review process. Over 50 years later, we're still here with nuclear weapons not just around, but actually at the moment gaining in salience in some states. Now, the majority of countries in the NPT and globally is keeping their part of the bargain in the NPT, that is not acquiring nuclear weapons for now. But do we want this bargain to fall apart again? As I mentioned before, when the NPT was negotiated, there was a real prospect of dozens of nuclear-armed countries. Countries like Germany, Sweden, and so on were considering developing their own nuclear weapons. Do we want to go back to this kind of scenario? But despite the many words, many positive words by nuclear-armed states about the NPT, there is simply no concrete plan for nuclear disarmament being put forward by the nuclear-armed states or their allies. There's just lots of explanation that we first have to reach a state of security nirvana, or more formally, undiminished security for all, before any concrete nuclear disarmament can take place. And this is simply unacceptable for the vast majority of countries. So with the TPNW, beyond the stigmatization that I just mentioned, we also created or proposed 2 concrete pathways towards nuclear disarmament. And in an intensive process that's ongoing with leading academics and affected communities, we're actually in the process of working out practical modalities, from establishing victim assistance and environmental remediation, which is long overdue, to figuring out the technical aspects of ensuring irreversible nuclear disarmament. Now, some critics claim we're trying to establish an alternative to the NPT or something that's incompatible with the NPT. But really, this is exactly what the NPT calls for: effective measures towards nuclear disarmament. And in addition, we as TPNW states are actually doubling down on our rejection of nuclear weapons. We've adopted far more comprehensive prohibitions, from testing to stationing and assistance, for ourselves. And how is that undermining the NPT? We aren't simply fulfilling the NPT, we're doubling down on our commitment to nuclear disarmament. And with it, we're doing what's probably the most important risk reduction measure right now, that is to reinforce the taboo against the threat and use of nuclear weapons. So to wrap up, there has been a significant shift in the nuclear disarmament discussion, reframing the debate away from deterrence towards the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. Also a shift away from the dominance of nuclear deterrence proponents towards the majority of states not willing to accept this concept for international security. And thereby, it's a beginning of a process of stigmatization of nuclear weapons, bringing back life into the nuclear disarmament architecture and showing a path away from the current prospect of another nuclear arms race. So thank you for your attention, and I hope I've piqued your interest. There's the second meeting of states parties in New York at the end of November, in case you're interested in also looking at that more closely. And I'm looking forward to our discussion to also maybe go into some more depth. And of course, we in the Austrian team would be happy to talk to you more at a later time, should you also have more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.